Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories. Tonight we're doing something a little different, a little closer to home, and honestly a little more unsettling than anything we've covered before. Tonight we're not going back to the plague, the mud, or the leeches. Tonight we're going back to the 90s. The decade of frosted tips, dial-up internet,
we find
and
the
the
strength
quiet,
to carry
grinding
on.
cruelty of an
Together
era that
we can
decided
overcome
women's
any
bodies were a
obstacle.
project that needed fixing. We're talking about the 1990s diet craze, the fat-free cookies that tasted like compressed cardboard, the slim, fast shakes that smelled like a chemistry experiment,
This is lovely.
the celebrity
Yes, it
before
really
and
is.
afters plastered across every magazine cover in America, and the deeply exhausted women behind all of it, counting calories in the dark like it was a second job that paid in shame. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. It means more than you know. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And honestly, if this topic hits a little close to home for some of you, that's okay. You are in good company tonight. Now, before we begin, have you ever wondered what it was actually like to grow up in the 90s as a woman? Did you ever count how many times a magazine told you to lose weight in a single issue? Did you know that fat-free actually meant full of sugar? Or did everyone just quietly agree not to talk about that? Could you name 10 snack foods from the 90s that have since been proven to be nutritional disasters marketed as health food? Did women actually believe the grapefruit diet would work? Or did they just keep doing it because everyone else was doing it too? What did it feel like to live in a body that the entire culture was treating like a problem to be solved? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1994. The television is blaring an infomercial for a Thigh Master. Your breakfast is a rice cake. And somewhere nearby, a magazine is telling you that this summer, finally, you can have the body you've always wanted. All you have to do is want it badly enough. Good luck. Let's start at the very beginning of the day, which in the 90s did not begin with coffee or a stretch or even an alarm clock for a lot of women. It began with the scale, before your feet had properly registered the floor, before your eyes had adjusted to the light, before you'd done a single thing in the world that morning, the scale was already waiting. Cold, white, and completely indifferent to how you felt about it. You stepped on, you looked down, and the number you saw determined with eerie completeness what kind of day you were going to have. If it was lower than yesterday, something in your chest relaxed, just a little, just enough to feel like you had earned your breakfast. If it was higher, well, the day was already ruined, and it was barely 7 in the morning. This was not a fringe habit. This was the morning routine of millions of American women in the 1990s, recommended by diet programs, reinforced by magazines, and treated by the culture as simply what responsible women did. Track the number, monitor the progress, stay accountable. The scale was your daily report card, and you were both the student and the one grading the paper. It is worth pausing on how strange this actually is. You slept. Your body spent 8 hours repairing tissue, regulating hormones, cycling through the biological processes that keep a human being alive and functional. And your first response to this feat of unconscious maintenance was to stand on a small plastic device and assign the entire night a grade. The ritual had a very specific texture to it. The bathroom in the early morning, cold tile under bare feet. The particular stillness of the house before anyone else was awake. The careful way you stepped on, feet together, breath held, as though the exhale might add something, and then the looking down. Some women looked immediately. Some looked away first and then looked, as though the delay might soften whatever the number was. Some women weighed themselves before and after using the toilet, calculating the difference. Some weighed themselves multiple times, convinced the first reading was somehow off, hoping the second or third would be more forgiving. It was not a system designed to produce peace of mind. It was a system designed to produce surveillance, and it worked exactly as designed. Diet programs in the 90s formalized this habit enthusiastically. Weight Watchers ask members to weigh in weekly at meetings in front of a group recorded in a little booklet. Other programs ask for daily tracking. The expectation was not just that you would lose weight, but that you would demonstrate that you were monitoring yourself at all times, that you had internalized the project of managing your own body with sufficient seriousness to show up, step on, and be counted. What nobody said out loud, at least not loudly enough, was that the scale is a remarkably poor measure of almost everything it was being used to measure. It cannot tell the difference between muscle and fat. It cannot account for water retention, hormonal fluctuation, the weight of a meal, the timing of a digestion cycle. It responds to things that have nothing to do with health, a salty dinner, a humid night, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. But in the 90s, none of that nuance was in the room. The number was the number, and you were its subject. The cruel irony was the timing. Starting your day with a ritual designed to remind you that your body was a problem to be solved did not, as it turned out, produce the calm, disciplined mindset that diet culture promised. What it tended to produce was anxiety, preoccupation, and a relationship with your own breakfast that was significantly more fraught than a bowl of cereal has any right to be. But the scale stayed on the bathroom floor, because getting rid of it felt like giving up, and giving up in the 90s was the one thing you were absolutely never allowed to do. Let's talk about the magazines. And I don't mean a couple of them, I mean the wall of them. The glossy, gleaming, floor-to-ceiling wall at every grocery store checkout, every dentist's waiting room, every hair salon in the country, all of them, without exception, featuring a woman on the cover who had apparently solved the problem of existing in a body. Cosmopolitan, glamour, self, shape, women's world, Vogue. Each one a slightly different promise with exactly the same message underneath. You're close, but not quite there yet. Here is what to do about it. And the thing is, you didn't even have to buy them. They were just there, everywhere, all the time. A permanent low hum of not enough whispering from every waiting room in America. Pick up any major women's magazine from the mid-90s and flip through it. What you find is not subtle. A single issue of a popular women's magazine from this era might contain, without any apparent awareness of the contradiction, a feature on loving your body, an advertisement for a meal replacement shake, a recipe for a decadent chocolate cake, a 3-page spread on the 10 best exercises to lose your stomach, and an interview with a celebrity who has just announced her new diet plan, all between the same 2 covers. The mixed messaging wasn't accidental, it was structural. Magazines made money from advertising. Advertisers sold diet products, beauty products, and clothing. The more a reader felt dissatisfied with her current self, the more likely she was to buy something to fix it. The magazine's job was to produce that dissatisfaction reliably, issue after issue, and then graciously offer the cure. The cover lines were a masterclass in manufacturing anxiety with a smile. Lose 10 pounds by summer, drop a dress size in 30 days, flatten your belly fast, get the body you've always wanted. These were not occasional features. They were the consistent, relentless drumbeat of every issue, every month, every year throughout the decade. Researchers who studied magazine content in the 90s found that the majority of articles in major women's magazines were connected in some way to appearance. And within that category, weight and dieting were consistently dominant. You could read a women's magazine from cover to cover in the 90s and come away with the impression that the most important thing happening in any woman's life at any given moment was what she weighed and what she was doing about it, and the photography. Let us not skip the photography. Every fashion spread, every celebrity profile, every fitness feature featured women in a very specific physical range, thin, toned, symmetrical, styled within an inch of their lives, and lit in ways that were specifically engineered to make them look as smooth and flawless as a product rendering. These images were not presented as the result of professional photography, makeup artistry, strategic lighting, and increasingly in the late 90s, early digital retouching. They were presented as just what women looked like, as normal, as the before that you could achieve if you followed the advice on the opposite page. The effect was cumulative and quiet. You didn't read one magazine and decide you were inadequate. You existed in a world where this was the wallpaper, constant, ambient, unavoidable, and over time it simply became the water you swam in. A generation of women grew up genuinely unsure whether their dissatisfaction with their bodies was a personal feeling or a reasonable response to objective reality. Which was, from the magazine industry's perspective, exactly the point. It's time for a snack, a very 90s snack, and before you reach for it, let's be clear about something. It has 0 fat. It says so right there on the box, in bold. With an exclamation point, as though the absence of one macronutrient is something worth celebrating with punctuation. Welcome to the era of fat-free everything. The decade when the food industry quietly removed the fat from half the products on supermarket shelves, replaced it with sugar, corn syrup, and a handful of additives with names that sounded like chemical elements, and then sold it all back to women as health food. The Snackwell's cookie was the symbol of this particular era. A cookie that somehow convinced an entire generation that eating the whole box was fine because the box said fat-free. The cookie tasted like someone had described the concept of sweetness to a machine that had never actually tasted anything. But women ate them by the sleeveful, standing over the kitchen counter, because the math seemed right. To understand the fat-free craze, you have to understand where it came from. In the 1980s, research linking dietary fat to heart disease had made fat the enemy, at least in popular culture, where the nuance of the original research was quickly left behind. By the early 90s, the low-fat gospel had fully arrived. The USDA food pyramid, released in 1992, placed fats and oils at the very top, in the tiny section labelled "use sparingly," while carbohydrates sat triumphantly at the wide base. The message was clear. Fat was the problem. Remove the fat, and you removed the danger. The food industry, which had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment, responded with extraordinary speed and enthusiasm. Within a few years, fat-free and low-fat versions of essentially everything were available on supermarket shelves. Fat-free salad dressing that tasted like seasoned water. Low-fat ice cream with the approximate texture of frozen disappointment. Fat-free cream cheese that would not spread without tearing the bread into small sad pieces. Fat-free mayonnaise, which is a sentence that should never have been possible. The products were not good. They were not particularly nutritious, but they were marketed with aggressive confidence. And in the 90s, the words fat-free on a label functioned as a kind of moral clearance, a permission slip to eat the thing without guilt. The problem, and food scientists knew this at the time, was that when you remove fat from a processed food product, it tends to taste like cardboard because fat carries flavour. The solution the industry settled on was sugar. Add more sugar, add corn syrup, add other sweeteners and stabilisers to replace the mouthfeel and the flavour that the fat had provided. The result was products that were technically lower in fat but often higher in sugar and total processed ingredients than their original versions. They were not healthier, they were just differently compromised, and yet the marketing worked so well that an entire behavioural phenomenon emerged, the Snackwell effect, documented by researchers who noticed that people were eating more of a fat-free product than they would have eaten of the full-fat version, because the fat-free label seemed to make the food morally neutral. The box said fat-free. The math said it was fine. The body, quietly keeping its own accounts, did not get the memo. The 90s fat-free craze was not a mistake born of ignorance. It was a masterpiece of food marketing dressed up as a health revolution. You ate the cookie. You ate the whole sleeve. You were following the rules. The rules were just not the rules you thought they were. Let's talk about the meal replacement. Not a meal, not really. A meal replacement, a carefully worded distinction that should have been the first clue that something strange was happening. In the 90s, Slim Fast was everywhere. The slogan was simple and quietly devastating. A shake for breakfast, a shake for lunch, and then a sensible dinner. Which raises the obvious question, sensible by whose definition exactly? The shakes came in chocolate, vanilla and strawberry, and they tasted roughly the way a vitamin smells, vaguely of something pleasant that has been processed until all the actual pleasantness has been removed. They were designed to be consumed in minutes, to require no preparation, no sitting down, no ritual, no pleasure. They were fuel without the experience of eating. And millions of women drank them, standing at the kitchen counter or sitting in their cars in parking lots, because the commercials showed smiling women in smaller jeans, and that seemed like enough of a reason. Slim Fast had existed since the late 1970s, but hit the cultural mainstream in the late 80s and exploded through the 90s. By 1993, it was the best-selling diet product in the United States. The advertising was relentless and strategically targeted: daytime television, women's magazines, radio spots during the morning commute. The spokesmodels were always thin, always cheerful, always implying without quite saying that the shake was the reason. Tommy Lasorda, the baseball manager, did commercials for a period, which was somewhat confusing, but the core demographic was always the same. Women who wanted a simple solution, a clear system, a plan they could follow without having to think too hard about it. The appeal made a kind of exhausted sense. The 90s working woman was already managing a job, often a family, a household, and the general pressure of a culture that expected her to do all of that while also looking like she had personally solved the puzzle of nutrition. A shake required no decisions, no standing in front of the refrigerator at 7 in the morning trying to figure out what counted as healthy. No negotiating with yourself about portions. You opened the can, you drank it, and you had technically had breakfast. The decision had been made for you. The thinking had been done. All you had to do was comply. What the marketing did not dwell on was the experience of compliance. 2 shakes a day is 2 meals replaced with something that does not look, smell, or taste like food in any meaningful sense. It does not require you to sit down. It does not involve warmth, or texture, or the small daily ritual of preparing something and then eating it with your hands. It removed food from the category of experience and placed it firmly in the category of problem management. Hunger was not something to be satisfied. It was something to be handled. The shake handled it. Move on. The sensible dinner, meanwhile, did considerable heavy lifting in the marketing, implying a roomy third meal that balanced out the restriction of the first 2. In practice, the research on very low-intake meal replacement plans showed the predictable results. Short-term loss followed by rebound when the plan became unsustainable, which it almost always did, because human beings are not designed to drink their meals out of a can forever. The company knew the pattern. The repeat purchase rate was excellent. The Slim in Slim Fast, it turned out, was more durable as a brand name than as long-term outcome. Let's talk about the celebrities. Because in the 90s, you could not open a magazine, turn on a talk show, or walk past a newsstand without being informed about what a famous woman weighed, had weighed, currently planned to weigh, and which specific system of deprivation she was using to get there. Oprah Winfrey, Cindy Crawford, Mariah Carey, Kathy Lee Gifford, each one attached to a diet, a plan, a before and after, a public moment of either triumph or failure that was treated with the gravity of actual news. Oprah's weight was covered like a political campaign. When she lost 67 pounds in 1988, and wheeled a wagon of fat onto her stage, the audience went wild. When she gained it back, the tabloids treated it like a tragedy. None of this was quiet, none of it was private, and none of it happened to men. The celebrity diet story had a very specific narrative structure in the 90s, and it repeated so often it became almost invisible through familiarity. Act 1. The celebrity is photographed looking larger than the culture has decided she should be, or she mentions publicly that she has gained weight, or a tabloid runs a story with a beach photograph taken from an unflattering angle. Act 2. The celebrity announces a plan. She has found the thing, the trainer, the program, the lifestyle change, the product. Act 3. The reveal. The magazine cover, the before and after spread, the interview where she talks about how she did it and how you can too. Act 4, which did not always make the magazines, was the private reality of maintaining a body under constant public scrutiny, which was typically somewhat less triumphant than the cover suggested. The machinery behind this was not accidental. Celebrity diet stories sold magazines. Celebrity diet endorsements sold products. A famous woman who had publicly lost weight was an extraordinarily valuable marketing asset, and the diet industry understood this with perfect clarity. Jenny Craig's most famous client in the 90s was Monica Lewinsky. Sybil Shepherd did commercials for a weight loss program. Delta Burke, Queen Latifah, Kirstie Alley, women who were widely admired and talented, were talked about primarily in terms of their weight, their plans and their results. The message to every ordinary woman watching was both clear and relentless. If she can do it, you can do it. And if you haven't done it yet, you haven't tried hard enough. What this also meant was that famous women existed in a state of permanent public accountability for their bodies that had no equivalent for their male counterparts. A male celebrity could gain weight between films, and the coverage, if it existed at all, was generally framed as a transformation, a role, or a health concern expressed with sympathy. A female celebrity who gained weight was a cautionary tale, a clickable story, a reason to print an old bikini photo alongside a new one for direct comparison. The double standard was so consistent and so total that it barely registered as a double standard. It was just how things were. It was just what famous women were for. Now it is time to exercise, not because it feels good, not because your body is strong and capable and worth celebrating, but because you ate a muffin on Tuesday and the math has to balance. Welcome to the 90s aerobics class, a very specific cultural institution that combined punishment, performance, and extremely loud music into one 60-minute experience that left you both exhausted and somehow still feeling like it wasn't quite enough. The instructor was always tiny. The leotards were always high-cut. The steps were called things like the grapevine and the mambo and required a level of coordination that no one admitted they didn't have. You bounced, you kicked, you grapevined your way across a mirrored room in a sports bra that had not actually been engineered for support, and you counted every burned calorie like a small personal victory over your own body. The aerobics boom had started in the 1980s with Jane Fonda, but by the 90s it was fully institutionalized. Every mid-sized town had at least one gym with a mirrored aerobics studio and a schedule full of classes with names like Step Attack and Cardio Blast and Fat Burner, all of which communicated before you had done a single lunge that the purpose of your presence was to eliminate something that was currently on your body and needed to go. The mirrors were not incidental. They were the whole point. You were meant to watch yourself, to monitor yourself, to notice the distance between what you currently were and what the instructor at the front of the room represented. The language around exercise in this era was almost entirely caloric. You did not go to aerobics class to build cardiovascular health, or because movement felt satisfying, or because an hour of physical activity often makes a difficult day slightly easier to navigate. You went to burn. Magazines printed charts. 30 minutes of aerobics equals this many calories. An hour of step class equals that many. The math was always presented in terms of food. This many minutes of exercise cancels out that piece of cake. Exercise was not a pleasure. It was a debt repayment system. You ate something, you owed something, and the aerobics class was where you settled the account. The gym aesthetic of the decade deserves its own brief moment of attention. The high-cut leotard worn over bicycle shorts, the scrunchie, the colour palette of early 90s activewear, which operated primarily in fuchsia, teal, and a particular shade of purple that has mercifully not returned. The low-impact aerobics, the high-impact aerobics, the step platform, the resistance bands, the thigh machine that was in every gym, and whose actual effectiveness was broadly disputed but whose existence communicated very clearly which body parts were considered problems in need of equipment. It was a whole visual language, and the language said, your body is a project, the gym is the workshop, and the instructor at the front is living proof that if you work hard enough, you can build a different one. The cruelest part was that it often worked, short-term, in the narrow way that intense caloric expenditure always produces short-term results. And those results were credited entirely to the system, the class, the plan, the instructor, the gym, rather than to the person who had worked very hard for them. Which meant that when the results slowed, or plateaued, or reversed, the credit system ran in reverse too. It wasn't the system that had failed, it was you. Let's talk about thighs, specifically about the space between them, or the space that wasn't there but was supposed to be. The thigh gap was not invented in the 90s, but it was quietly industrialised. It showed up in the Victoria's Secret catalogues that arrived in the mail. It appeared in the pages of every magazine targeted at women, between the ages of 14 and 45. It was visible on every runway, every red carpet, every MTV video. Nobody officially said you were supposed to have one. They didn't need to. They just kept showing it to you, over and over, until your brain quietly filed it under normal, and your own body, the body that walked and climbed and held people and worked every day without complaint, started to feel like it had gotten something wrong. Here is a piece of basic anatomy that did not make it into the women's magazines of the 90s. Whether a person has a thigh gap is determined primarily by the width of their pelvis and the angle at which their femur attaches to their hip. It is a skeletal characteristic. It has essentially nothing to do with how much a person weighs or how much they exercise. You can be at any weight and have one, or not have one. You cannot reliably create one by doing inner thigh exercises or cutting particular foods from your diet. This was known. It was not secret information. And yet the thigh gap was presented throughout this decade as an achievement, a visible proof of dedication, of discipline, of having done the work. Women exercised toward it. Women restricted toward it. Women measured the distance between their legs in bathroom mirrors as a form of daily self-assessment. And the thigh gap was only one entry in a whole taxonomy of aspirational body geometries that the 90s produced. The flat stomach, the visible collarbone, the slim upper arms, specifically the tricep area, which spawned an entire subcategory of targeted exercise recommendations, and was referred to in fitness circles as bat wings, a term so cheerfully horrible that it is remarkable nobody stopped and asked out loud whether we were all okay. The thigh gap, the flat stomach, the slim arms, these were not health metrics. No doctor had ever said that a visible gap between the femurs was a clinical indicator of anything. But the culture had decided they were proof of something, and the absence of them was proof of something else. What made this particularly insidious was the way these standards operated through imagery rather than instruction. No magazine ever said, "Your thighs must not touch." They simply showed you, month after month, women whose thighs did not touch, in contexts that coded those bodies as aspirational, desirable, successful, and in control. The standard was communicated entirely through visual repetition, which meant there was nothing to argue with. You couldn't dispute an instruction that had never been given. You could only look at the images and feel the quiet, persistent sense that your own body was failing some test whose rubric had never been written down. The fashion industry's contribution to this was substantial and largely unapologetic. Sample sizes for runway clothing in the 90s were cut for bodies at the extreme low end of the weight spectrum. Designers showed collections on women selected specifically for being as thin as possible, and then those images were published in every magazine, distributed globally, and treated as the authoritative visual record of what women were supposed to look like. No disclaimer, no context, just the photograph, the dress, and the implication that this was normal, that this was what women who had their lives together looked like, and that the rest of you were simply not there yet. It is lunchtime, and today you are having half a grapefruit, 2 eggs, and the quiet dignity of a person who is definitely not going to think about bread for the rest of the afternoon. Welcome to the world of the 90s fad diet, a rotating cast of eating plans so bizarre, so arbitrary, and so nutritionally questionable that they would be funny if they hadn't been followed by actual human beings with genuine desperation and real hunger. The grapefruit diet promised that something in the grapefruit itself, some mysterious fat-burning enzyme, would do the heavy lifting if you just ate half of one before every meal. This was not true. No such enzyme exists. Researchers have noted that grapefruit does have some interaction with certain medications through an enzyme called CYP3A4, which affects how the body processes various compounds. But this has nothing to do with fat burning and everything to do with why your cardiologist asks about your grapefruit consumption before prescribing certain drugs. The diet worked, to the extent that it worked at all, because it was extremely low in overall intake, and therefore produced the result that any extremely low intake produces, which is temporary loss at significant physiological cost. The cabbage soup diet operated on a similar principle with a different flavour profile. The plan involved eating a specific recipe of cabbage soup, essentially cabbage, onion, tomato, and various vegetables boiled together into something that could be described generously as rustic, as the foundation of 7 days of eating, supplemented on different days by specific additional foods. Day 1, fruit and soup. Day 2, vegetables and soup. Day 3, fruit, vegetables and soup. No bananas, no potatoes, nothing that might make any of this tolerable. By day 4, most participants reported thinking about food with the focused intensity of a person stranded in the wilderness. The diet was effective in the same narrow sense as all severe restriction. It produced rapid results in the short term. It also produced in many cases significant digestive distress, fatigue, and the particular psychological experience of spending a week obsessively planning what you were going to eat the moment the 7 days were over. The Beverly Hills diet, popular in the early 90s, was built on the theory of food combining, the idea that certain foods should not be eaten together because they digest at different rates and interfere with each other's processing in the body. The science behind this did not exist, a detail that did not noticeably slow its popularity. The diet required eating only fruit for the first 10 days, then introducing very specific food combinations in a very specific sequence. The author of the original book, Judy Mazzell, was not a nutritionist or a doctor. She was, by her own account, someone who'd been told she would be fat forever and had decided to prove otherwise, which was presented not as a concern but as a credential. What all of these diets shared, beneath their different premises and wildly different food lists, was a single structural feature. They were all forms of significant restriction dressed up in pseudoscientific clothing. The enzyme, the food combining, the specific vegetable, these were explanatory narratives that made the restriction feel principled, purposeful, like something you were doing for a reason rather than simply eating less. The reason mattered psychologically. It transformed hunger from deprivation into discipline. It made the discomfort feel like evidence that the plan was working, and it gave you something to explain to other people when they noticed you were eating half a grapefruit for lunch again. Let's do some math. Not the fun kind. The other kind. The kind where you're standing in a supermarket aisle, squinting at the back of a yogurt container at 7 in the evening, trying to calculate whether 90 counts as acceptable or a moral failing. Calorie counting in the 90s was not a casual wellness tool. It was a daily reckoning. Women kept food diaries. They memorized numbers the way other people memorized phone numbers, not because they wanted to, but because somewhere along the way the number on every package became more important than how the food tasted, or how it made you feel, or whether you were actually hungry at all. The goal was almost always the same: stay under a very low daily threshold. Some women went lower. The number that diet culture promoted as a maintenance or weight loss target for women in this era was, for the record, roughly what a small child needs to sustain basic bodily function. For an adult woman doing anything at all, working, commuting, existing, it is not enough. But the magazines called it a plan. The food diary was the physical artifact of this obsession. Not a journal in any meaningful sense, not a place for reflection or experience or what the meal tasted like or who you shared it with. A ledger. Columns and numbers. Every item entering the body assigned a value and recorded. Diet programs encouraged this practice with evangelical consistency. Track everything, every bite, every drink, every handful. The act of writing it down would make you conscious, accountable, controlled. And it did. In a way, it made women intensely, relentlessly conscious of everything they ate, from the perspective of a system that had decided food was primarily a mathematical problem with a correct answer. The numbers themselves were memorized with the automaticity of a second language. A banana was this many. A slice of bread was that many. A restaurant meal was a source of anxiety because the numbers were hidden, unavailable, unverifiable, threatening in their ambiguity. Women in the 90s developed elaborate strategies for managing restaurant eating, asking for dressing on the side, splitting plates, eating something small before arriving so as not to seem hungry, ordering from the salad menu while everyone else ordered actual food and then pretending not to feel the difference. The social performance of not being hungry, or of appearing indifferent to food, was its own exhausting project that ran parallel to the actual project of trying to eat less. What chronic calorie-focused tracking produces in the mind, and researchers documented this extensively through the 90s and into the 2000s, is a heightened preoccupation with food rather than a reduced one. The more energy a person spends thinking about what they are or are not allowed to eat, the more mental real estate food occupies. Women who counted obsessively reported thinking about food, in some form, for large portions of every day, planning the next meal, calculating the last one, calculating the next one, revising the calculation when something unplanned entered the picture. This is not the relaxed, intuitive relationship with eating that the human body is actually designed for. It is the opposite. But in the 90s, the preoccupation was reframed as mindfulness. You were paying attention. You were being responsible. You were doing the work. The deepest absurdity of the calorie-counting era was that it required women to become amateur nutritional biochemists in order to manage a biological process that, absent the intervention of diet culture, largely manages itself. The human body has spent several 100,000 years developing mechanisms for regulating hunger, satiety, energy balance, and food intake. Those mechanisms are not perfect, and they interact with the modern food environment in complicated ways. But they exist, and they work tolerably well when they are allowed to. Calorie counting in its 90s form was a systematic override of those mechanisms, a spreadsheet placed on top of a living system and declared superior to it. The spreadsheet was not superior to it, but the 90s did not know that yet, or rather, it did not want to. Now let's talk about the pills, because in the 90s, if diet and exercise weren't working fast enough, and they were never working fast enough, because the goal kept moving, there was always a pharmaceutical option waiting. The most famous and most catastrophic was the combination of fenfluramine and phentermine, sold under the name fen-phen. In the mid-90s, fen-phen was not fringe. It was mainstream. Doctors prescribed it. Women's magazines covered it with breathless enthusiasm. Clinics specializing in weight loss handed it out like a solution. By 1996, an estimated 18 million Americans had been prescribed it. Then, in 1997, researchers began noticing something alarming. Women who had taken fen-phen were developing heart valve abnormalities and a rare, fatal lung condition called primary pulmonary hypertension. The drug was pulled from the market. The lawsuits that followed totaled in the billions. What fen-phen represented was not a rogue product that had somehow slipped past scientific scrutiny. It was the logical endpoint of a medical culture that had, throughout the 90s, treated body weight as a primary health risk to be eliminated at considerable cost and at significant speed. The diet pill industry in this era was enormous and only loosely regulated. Phentermine, one half of the fen-phen combination, was a stimulant related chemically to amphetamines, part of a family of compounds that had been used in weight loss medications since the 1950s, periodically withdrawn due to safety concerns, reformulated, rebranded and reintroduced. Fenfluramine affected serotonin levels in the brain and had its own checkered history. The combination had never been tested in long-term clinical trials before being widely prescribed. The enthusiasm of the medical community for the drug in the mid-90s was driven by the same cultural assumption that drove the magazines and the diet programs and the morning weigh-ins, that thinness was so categorically desirable that the risk calculation in pursuit of it was permanently weighted toward intervention. The over-the-counter diet pill market was even less regulated and considerably stranger. Herbal preparations and supplements with names that gestured at speed and efficiency, Dexatrim, Accutrim, various thermogenic formulas, filled pharmacy shelves and television infomercials. Many of these contained ephedrine, a stimulant derived from the ephedra plant, which could increase heart rate, raise blood pressure, and cause significant cardiovascular strain. The products were marketed as natural, as though the origin of a compound in a plant was a guarantee of its safety, which is not how pharmacology works. Ephedra remained legal and widely used in weight loss supplements well into the early 2000s, when it was finally banned by the FDA after being linked to dozens of deaths. The pills worked in the way that stimulants always work, by suppressing appetite and increasing metabolic rate through mechanisms that place significant stress on the cardiovascular system. They produced results that seemed, in the short term, like validation of the approach. The results showed up on the scale. The scale had become the primary metric of success. Everything else, heart rate, blood pressure, sleep quality, bone density, the accumulated physiological cost of stimulant use, was not on the scale and therefore did not count. Women took the pills because the culture had taught them that the number on the scale was the most important number in their lives. The pills moved the number. The fact that they moved several other numbers simultaneously, in directions that were significantly less desirable, was a detail the marketing had not emphasized. Let's move to the living room. It is Saturday morning. You have cleared a space between the coffee table and the couch. You have pressed play on a VHS tape. And now a very cheerful, very lean woman on television is telling you that you can do this, that you are strong, that 8 more counts will change everything. The fitness video was one of the defining objects of the 90s household. Jane Fonda had pioneered the format in the early 1980s, but by the 90s it had fully metastasized into a cultural institution. Denise Austin, Cindy Crawford, Kathy Smith, Paula Abdul, each one with a tape, a smile, and a promise that this format, in your living room, in your own home, with no witnesses, would be the thing that finally worked. And millions of women press play, every morning or every other morning or every Monday for the rest of their lives, following along in their socks on cold hardwood floors, doing grapevines past the furniture. The fitness video occupied a very particular psychological space in the 90s domestic landscape. It was private in a way the gym was not. You did not have to walk into a room full of people in matching spandex and perform fitness in front of strangers. You could close the curtains, you could wear whatever you wanted, you could quietly fall behind the instructor by 4 counts and no one would know. This privacy was partly liberating and partly its own kind of trap, because it meant that the practice was entirely self-monitored, self-motivated, and self-evaluated, with no external accountability except the tape itself and the woman on it, who never got tired, never took a break, and smiled continuously throughout in a way that was either deeply inspiring or faintly terrifying, depending on your disposition. The tapes were sold with language that told you exactly what kind of project you were undertaking. Cindy Crawford's Shape Your Body workout, Kathy Smith's fat-burning workout, Denise Austin's Hit the Spot series, which offered targeted routines for specific body parts, thighs, abs, buns, as though the body were a renovation project you could address room by room. The titles did not say feel better or get stronger or enjoy moving. They said shape and burn and hit the spot. The spot in this context was never your cardiovascular endurance or your bone density. The spot was always the piece of your body that the culture had decided was currently the most in need of correction. Denise Austin was perhaps the definitive fitness video personality of the era, relentlessly upbeat, permanently encouraging, and possessed of a flexibility and energy that she made look effortless, which was its own particular form of pressure. She presented a version of exercise that was cheerful rather than punishing, which was genuinely a softer approach than some of what the era offered. But the underlying logic remained the same. You were doing this to change the shape of your body, and the shape you were trying to change it toward was hers. The friendliness of the delivery did not alter the direction of the instruction. What the fitness video also did, quietly and consistently, was colonize time that had previously been unscheduled. Saturday mornings, the hour before the kids woke up, the 30 minutes after dinner, exercise, which had once been something that happened as part of daily life, walking, carrying, moving through the world, became a separate dedicated project requiring specific clothing, a cleared space, and a structured routine. And when you missed a day, or a week, or 3 weeks because life intervened, the tape sat on the shelf with a particular silent reproach of a goal deferred. It was never neutral. It was always either evidence that you were doing the right thing or evidence that you weren't. There was no third option. Let's talk about the meetings. The Weight Watchers meeting was a very specific social ritual of the 90s, held in church basements and community centres and the back rooms of strip mall offices, usually on Tuesday evenings, usually with folding chairs and a woman at the front with a box of pamphlets, and the particular energy of someone who has lost 32 pounds and wants you to understand that it changed her entire life. Weight Watchers had been around since the 1960s, but in the 90s it was everywhere, mainstream, endorsed by celebrities, operating on a point system that turned every meal into a small numerical negotiation. Each food had a value, each day had a budget, and you were supposed to stay inside it, which sounds manageable until it is 11 at night and you're staring at the last 4 points of your day, wondering if a banana is worth it. Weight Watchers was, compared to many of the era's diet offerings, relatively sophisticated in its approach. It did not ask you to eliminate entire food groups. It did not sell you a proprietary shake or require you to buy prepackaged meals from a catalogue. It offered a community, a structure, and a system, 3 things that people in distress about their weight genuinely wanted, and which the organisation provided with considerable consistency. The meetings were the product as much as the points. You came back every week, you weighed in. You sat in the chair and listened to other women talk about their weeks, the dinner party that went sideways, the birthday cake that happened, the long walk that felt like a win, and you were supposed to feel less alone in the project. Sometimes it worked exactly that way. The community was real. The mutual recognition was real. But the architecture underneath it was still, at its foundation, a system of restriction and surveillance dressed in the language of support. The weekly weigh-in was public, or semi-public, recorded in the booklet, noted by the person at the desk compared to last week's number. The meeting leader celebrated losses and offered gentle encouragement for gains, but the mathematics of the structure made clear which direction was correct. A loss was a success to be applauded. A gain required an explanation. Members learned to have their explanations ready. It was a particularly 90s form of accountability, which essentially meant you owe other people a reckoning of your body. The point system, which Weight Watchers introduced and refined through the decade, was a genuine innovation in the diet industry's toolkit. Rather than requiring you to calculate and track specific numbers for every item you consumed, it assigned simplified values based on a formula. Lower fat, higher fibre foods had lower values. Higher fat, lower fibre foods cost more. The system steered behaviour through a value architecture, making some foods cheap and some foods expensive within the economy of the daily budget. It was elegant and genuinely easier to manage than rigid calorie tracking. It was also, beneath the redesigned numbers, the same fundamental project, training women to evaluate every food they encountered as a cost-benefit calculation rather than as nourishment, pleasure, or simply lunch. The gamification was effective precisely because games are motivating. You had a budget. You tried to stay within it. You won the week if the scale moved in the right direction. The framing converted a physiological process into a competition, with yourself as both the player and the stakes. And competitions, by definition, have losers. When the points ran out and you ate past them anyway, you had not just made a food choice. You had failed the game. The guilt that followed was built into the system, which meant, of course, that you needed the system more than ever to help you recover from having needed it. Let's slow down for a moment, because underneath all the cheerful magazine covers and the aerobics instructors and the fat-free cookie packaging, something was quietly going wrong for a significant number of women. Eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder were not invented in the 90s, but something happened in that decade that made them more common, more normalised, and more invisible than perhaps at any other time in recent history. The culture had built a perfectly calibrated machine for producing disordered eating, and then labelled all of it discipline, dedication, and health. A woman who survived on very little and exercised compulsively was not called sick. She was called motivated. A woman who binged and purged was not called someone who needed help. She was called someone who lacked willpower. The language of the era made it nearly impossible to see the line between dieting and disorder, because the culture had decided there was no line worth drawing. Research conducted throughout the 90s documented the scale of what was happening. Studies of adolescent girls in the United States consistently found that a significant majority, in some studies, more than half of the sample, reported currently dieting or having dieted recently at ages where the developing body does not benefit from restriction and may be actively harmed by it. Among college-aged women, rates of disordered eating behaviours were documented at levels that researchers described as epidemic. The behaviours in question, severe restriction, purging, excessive exercise, laxative use, were not fringe, they were widespread, and they existed on a spectrum with the behaviours the culture was actively endorsing, which made them extraordinarily difficult to identify, address, or treat. The clinical eating disorder community was aware of this and had been raising concerns for years. Eating disorder treatment specialists documented throughout the decade that the popular diet culture of the era was functioning as an on-ramp to clinical disorders, that the same behaviours recommended by mainstream diet programs, taken further and applied more rigidly, produced the symptoms that showed up in treatment settings. The difference between a diet and an eating disorder was, in many cases, a matter of degree rather than of kind, and the culture was actively encouraging degrees of restriction that sat very close to the clinical threshold. What made this especially difficult was the way the era's language framed severity as virtue. If some restriction was disciplined, then more restriction was more disciplined. If exercise was healthy, then more exercise was more healthy. The logic of more was built into the system, and there was no cultural counterweight, no mainstream voice saying enough, or this is too much, or the goal you are pursuing is making you sick. The counterweight existed in treatment clinics and eating disorder advocacy organisations, but these were not on the cover of Cosmopolitan. They were not in the daytime television lineup. They were not in the checkout line. Recovery in this environment required not just individual healing, but a kind of active resistance to the cultural context, which is an enormous amount to ask of someone who is already very unwell. And so the eating disorders of the 90s persisted, invisible in plain sight, sustained by a culture that was cheering loudly for the very behaviours that were causing harm. Let's talk about the look. Because in the early to mid-90s, fashion had a specific aesthetic, and if you were alive then, you know the one. It was called heroin chic, though that name only became widely used in retrospect, once enough people had gone on record saying it was a catastrophic idea. The look was extremely thin, pale, hollow-eyed, slouching, and vaguely unwell. Kate Moss in her early Calvin Klein campaign, the waif. The deliberately fragile silhouette photographed in washed-out light that made everyone look like they hadn't slept or eaten in several days. This was the dominant beauty standard in mainstream fashion during the early 90s. It was not aspirational in the conventional sense. It didn't look healthy or vibrant or joyful. It looked like something was very wrong, and yet it was everywhere, in every glossy editorial, on every runway, in every perfume advertisement. The aesthetic had specific cultural origins. It emerged partly as a reaction against the polished, high-gloss glamour of the late 80s, the shoulder pads, the big hair, the maximalism of that decade's beauty culture. Grunge had brought a rawer, more dishevelled visual sensibility to popular culture, and fashion absorbed it selectively, taking the visual language of unconcerned thinness and reframing it as an aesthetic position. The result was editorials shot in ways that emphasised pallor and boniness, casting choices that prioritised a very specific and very narrow body type, and a general visual vocabulary that associated extreme thinness with artistic seriousness, with authenticity, with being above the crass concern with looking well. The photographer Corinne Day's early work with Kate Moss is often cited as a foundational text of this aesthetic, raw, intimate photographs that documented a young woman's body in ways that fashion photography had not previously done, in contexts that felt genuinely unposed. The images were groundbreaking in certain technical and artistic respects. They were also images of a very thin 17-year-old girl, and they were used to sell perfume and clothing to millions of women and girls who absorbed from them not the technical photography discussion, but the simpler message: this is what women who matter look like. The cultural reckoning with heroin chic came publicly in 1997, when President Bill Clinton gave a speech explicitly naming the fashion industry's aesthetic as a contributor to drug use and eating disorders. The speech was notable primarily because it was a sitting president saying out loud what eating disorder advocates had been saying for years. The fashion industry responded with a brief period of visible discomfort and then largely continued as before, because the structural incentives, sample sizes, casting preferences, the economics of showing thin bodies in clothing had not changed. The aesthetic shifted somewhat in the late 90s toward a slightly less hollow version of the same narrow standard, which was presented as a meaningful correction and was, at best, a modest one. What heroin chic left behind was a generation of women who had absorbed, at formative ages, the visual equation between extreme thinness and sophistication, between looking unwell and looking interesting. That equation does not undo itself when the fashion industry declares a new aesthetic. It sits in the brain, filed under beauty, and continues to do its quiet work. Let's talk about the money, because behind every magazine cover, every meal replacement shake, every aerobics tape and calorie counter and bottle of diet pills, there was an industry. And by the mid-90s, the United States diet industry was worth approximately $33 billion annually. $33 billion. Built almost entirely on a product that, by most clinical measures, did not work, because the research had been clear for decades that the vast majority of people who lose weight through caloric restriction regain it within 3 to 5 years. The industry knew this. The business model depended on it. A product that worked once was a one-time sale. A product that required you to come back, try again, buy the new version, attend the new meeting, follow the new plan, that was a subscription. Women's dissatisfaction with their bodies was not an unfortunate side effect of the diet industry. It was the product. The economics are worth sitting with for a moment, because they explain so much about how the decade looked and felt. An industry built on repeat customers needs those customers to remain dissatisfied. If the product fully worked, if a woman completed a diet program and permanently resolved her relationship with her body and her weight, and never needed to buy another product, that was a customer lost. The industry's survival required a steady supply of women who believed they had not yet found the right plan, who were willing to try the next version, who blamed their own failure rather than the product's. The marketing accordingly emphasized personal responsibility at every turn. The product works. You have to work the product. If it didn't work for you, you didn't commit. Try again. Try harder. Here is the new version. This structure was not unique to the diet industry. It resembles the economics of several other industries that profit from ongoing management of chronic conditions. But there was something specifically efficient about the way the diet industry operated in the 90s, because it was not selling a treatment for a disease. It was selling a solution to a culturally constructed problem. The problem, that women's bodies were in need of ongoing management and correction, was not a medical consensus. It was a cultural position maintained by media, advertising, and the broader social environment. The diet industry did not create that position, but it invested enormously in sustaining it, because its revenue depended on the problem remaining unsolved. The investment took specific forms. Diet companies advertised heavily in magazines that happened to run editorial content about dieting. They sponsored television programs. They partnered with celebrities. They funded research, some of which found results that supported their products and was widely publicized, and some of which found less favorable results and was not. They lobbied against regulation of the supplement industry. They operated in the gaps between clinical nutrition research and popular understanding, translating the former into a version the latter could consume, and in the translation, consistently emphasizing hope over evidence. The $33 billion was not evenly distributed. A small number of large companies, Weight Watchers, Slim Fast, Jenny Craig, Nutrisystem, captured significant portions. Below them, An enormous ecosystem of smaller products, supplements, books, tapes, programs and services competed for the remainder. The competition produced innovation, but the innovation was primarily marketing innovation, new framings for the same fundamental product, which was caloric restriction repackaged for a culture that had decided it desperately needed one. Let's walk down a high school hallway in 1993. It is between classes. The lockers are that particular shade of industrial beige that no one chose on purpose. Someone nearby is eating a bag of chips, and two girls across the hall are looking at them with an expression that is somewhere between envy and judgment. You're 14, or 15, or 16, and your body is doing the specific thing that bodies do at that age, changing, expanding, redistributing, becoming something new, and the culture you're growing up inside of has decided that this process is a problem to be managed rather than a phenomenon to be survived with some basic dignity. Girls at this age in the 90s were receiving, from essentially every cultural direction available to them, the message that their bodies were already in need of improvement, before they were fully formed, before they had done anything with their lives at all. Adolescent girls in the 90s were not a niche audience for diet culture. They were one of its primary targets. The magazines that lined checkout aisles were read by teenage girls. The television programs that featured celebrity weight stories were watched by teenage girls. The fat-free food products were purchased in school cafeterias. The aerobics tapes were in the living room when teenage girls came home from school. The culture did not distinguish, in any meaningful way, between its messages for adult women managing their weight and its messages for teenage girls whose bodies were in the process of biological development. The messages were the same. The girls were expected to receive them the same way. What made this particularly consequential was timing. Adolescence is a developmental period during which the relationship with the body, its image, its worth, its meaning, is being formed in ways that tend to persist. The beliefs about bodies that are built at 14 and 15 are not superficial. They become foundational. Research conducted throughout the 90s and in the decades following documented consistently that early exposure to diet culture and early initiation of dieting behavior are significant predictors of disordered eating later in life. The younger the first diet, the stronger the association. This was not obscure academic knowledge. It was published. It was discussed in professional literature. It did not change what was in the magazines or on the shelves. The social dimension of high school diet culture in the 90s added its own layer. Dieting was social currency. Groups of girls dieted together, shared information about low-intake plans, competed quietly over food choices at lunch in ways that were both bonding rituals and races toward a destination that moved further away the closer you got. The girl who ate the least was not just thinner. She was, within certain social ecologies, more disciplined, more impressive, more in control. Control was the value. Food was the domain in which it was demonstrated. And in a developmental period when the sense of control over one's own life is often genuinely limited, the appeal of having one domain that you absolutely governed was not difficult to understand. Teachers and school counsellors of the era reported the same tension. They could see what was happening in the hallways and the cafeterias, but the culture outside the school walls was reinforcing exactly the behaviours that concerned them. You could have one conversation with a student about nutrition and healthy development. The student would then go home to 3 magazines, 4 television programs, and a household where these behaviours were normalised. The math of cultural influence was not close. Let's come inside now. Because the pressure didn't only come from magazines and television and the fluorescent lights of the gym. A lot of it came from much closer. It came from the dinner table. It came from a passing comment in the kitchen. It came in the form of a compliment that was really a comparison, or a concern that was really a judgment wearing comfortable shoes. Mothers who had grown up inside the same culture passed it along the way. You pass anything down. Not always deliberately, not always unkindly, but consistently, in the small daily language of food and bodies. "You look so good. Have you lost weight?" was a compliment. "Are you sure you want that second helping?" was care. "She has such a pretty face" was a sentence that never needed finishing. These were not villains. They were women who had themselves been measured and found wanting, passing along the only tools they had been given. The intergenerational transmission of body anxiety in the 90s has been studied with some specificity, and the findings are both unsurprising and quietly devastating. Daughters of mothers who dieted frequently were more likely to develop their own dieting behaviours. Mothers who made comments about their daughter's weight, even well-intentioned comments, even comments framed as health concerns, were more likely to have daughters who reported body dissatisfaction and disordered eating behaviours. The comments did not have to be cruel. They did not have to be frequent. A single well-placed remark from a trusted adult at a formative moment could do the work of an entire magazine. The body remembers what it heard in the kitchen at 13. And it was not only mothers. Fathers commented, brothers commented, the extended family gathered at Thanksgiving and commented. The aunt who had not seen you since last Christmas noted with apparent approval that you looked like you had lost weight, then helped herself to another serving of stuffing while you processed the implication that the previous Christmas version of you had been in need of improvement. Grandmothers offered food and then commented on whether you were watching yourself, which was not technically a contradiction, but functioned as one in practice. The romantic dimension added its own specific pressure. The 90s boyfriend's opinion of a girlfriend's body was treated in popular culture as a legitimate variable in the calculation of what a woman should weigh. Women's magazines ran surveys about what men found attractive, printed the results as though they were guidelines, and then ran adjacent pieces about loving yourself regardless of what men thought, apparently unaware of the tension. In real relationships, a boyfriend who said you've lost weight, you look amazing, was providing powerful behavioural reinforcement. A boyfriend who made less favourable comments about a girlfriend's appearance was, research consistently found, a significant predictor of her subsequent relationship with food. The home, in other words, was not a refuge from diet culture. It was often one of its most effective delivery systems. What made this layer of the pressure especially difficult to navigate was that it came wrapped in love. The magazine did not love you. The advertisement did not love you. But your mother did. Your partner did. Your grandmother did. And so the message, when it came from them, was harder to identify as pressure and easier to absorb as truth. The culture had distributed itself so thoroughly through intimate relationships that dismantling it required, in many cases, having difficult conversations with people you loved about things they had said without any intent to cause harm. Let's turn on the television. It is 3 p.m. The talk show is on, and today, as on many days in the 90s, someone's body is the topic. The 90s talk show was a remarkable cultural institution, and one of its most consistent subjects was women's weight, not women's health, not women's lives, women's weight specifically, as a problem, as a triumph, as a confession, as a reveal. Oprah's weight loss and gain was covered on her own show, and in every media outlet in the country, with a level of sustained interest that was genuinely unprecedented. Ricki Lake lost weight, and the audience cheered. Jenny Jones had a segment. Maury had a segment. Everyone had a segment. The message, delivered with sympathy and studio lighting, was always some version of the same thing. Your body is public. Your body is a story, and we are all entitled to follow it. Oprah Winfrey's relationship with her weight in the 90s is a story that deserves more careful attention than it usually receives, because it illustrates with unusual clarity what diet culture does to a person when that person happens to be doing their internal experience on live television. Oprah was one of the most powerful and successful people in American media. She had built a program that genuinely helped people, conducted some of the most consequential interviews of the decade, and demonstrated professional capability at the highest level. And yet, for much of the 90s, the dominant media narrative about her was about her weight. Her losses were covered as triumphs. Her gains were covered with a sympathy that was barely distinguishable from pity. She discussed her relationship with food publicly and at length, in ways that were honest and clearly came from a genuine place of struggle. And the audience received these disclosures with intense engagement. What this meant for the millions of women watching was a sustained lesson that even extraordinary professional success did not resolve the body question. Even at the top of your field, even with every resource available, the weight story followed you. If it followed Oprah, it followed everyone. The talk show format amplified this by providing a continuous supply of ordinary women willing to share their weight journeys on camera. The woman who had lost 50 pounds on a particular program, the woman who had regained it, the woman who was about to try a new approach. These segments were not presented as what they were, which was a format ideally suited to producing recurring guests. They were presented as stories of struggle and resilience, with the audience in the role of communal support system. The emotional texture was real. The structural incentive underneath it was also real, and it ran in a specific direction. The reveal was the apex of this format, the moment when a guest would stand, turn, or walk out in a new outfit following a transformation, and the audience would gasp and applaud. The reveal segment was the talk show equivalent of the magazine before and after photo, and it carried the same embedded instruction. Change is good, smaller is better, and the moment your body visibly changes is the most important moment in your story. Everything else, your work, your relationships, your interior life, was context for the body. The body was the subject. The 90s talk show said this with enormous warmth and sincerity, and a studio audience full of people who genuinely meant well. That is what made it so effective. Let's talk about the athletes, because you might reasonably assume that the athletic women of the 90s, the ones who were strong and fast and winning things, would have been exempt from this particular grind. They were not. Female athletes in the 90s existed at the intersection of two contradictory cultural demands. Be impressive, but don't be too big. Be strong, but stay small enough to remain legible as feminine. The Women's Sports Foundation documented throughout the 90s that female athletes at the collegiate and elite level were experiencing disordered eating at rates significantly higher than the general population, not despite their athleticism, but partially because of the specific pressures placed on athletic women to perform in a body that also met conventional beauty standards. A gymnast who was strong enough to flip through the air was still being weighed before competitions. A runner who could sustain a remarkable pace was still being told to watch her intake. The sports that required or rewarded a particular body aesthetic were the most visible sites of this pressure, but the problem was not limited to them. The phenomenon researchers called the female athlete triad, the clinical combination of low energy availability, disrupted menstrual function, and reduced bone density, was identified and named during this period specifically because it was being observed widely enough across sports to constitute a pattern requiring a name. The triad was the clinical endpoint of athletes who had reduced their intake below what their training demanded, whether because coaches had encouraged it, because the sports culture normalized it, or because they had grown up inside a broader culture that had been telling them since adolescence that smaller was better. The result was stress fractures, hormonal disruption, and in some cases long-term health consequences that outlasted the athletic career. The gymnastics world was particularly documented in this regard. The sport already selected for small bodies, trained them from extremely young ages, and operated under judging standards that were, in certain respects, aesthetic as well as athletic. Joan Ryan's book, Little Girls in Pretty Boxes, published in 1995, documented in specific and disturbing detail the ways that young gymnasts and figure skaters were weighed, measured, and spoken to about their bodies by the adults responsible for their development. The book received significant attention and coverage. It did not immediately change the culture of elite gymnastics. The structural incentives, the scoring systems, the selection processes, the coaching methods were more durable than the public conversation about them. What this meant for the broader culture was an additional layer of the same message, delivered this time through sports journalism. Even the women whose physical capability was most dramatically demonstrated were not exempt from having their bodies evaluated on aesthetic terms. A female athlete's weight could be noted in a profile in ways her male counterpart's weight was not. Her physique would be described. Her relationship with food might be mentioned. The strength required to do what she did was acknowledged. The aesthetic envelope within which that strength was expected to exist was also acknowledged, and the two were treated as equally valid considerations. That equation, you are impressive, and also your body is a visual subject to be evaluated, was absorbed by every girl watching, and it said, "There is no threshold of achievement past which the question of your body stops mattering. Let's make an appointment. It is Tuesday. You've decided to get serious. You've made an appointment with a nutritionist, or someone calling themselves one, because in many American states in the 90s, the title nutritionist was entirely unregulated, meaning that anyone could use it without any particular training or credential. You sit down across the desk. The person on the other side gives you a plan. It involves significant restriction. It does not ask you about your history with food, your relationship with your body, whether you have ever restricted before or whether there is anything going on in your life that might be connected to how you eat. It gives you a structure and a list. You leave feeling both hopeful and vaguely terrified, which was, in the 90s, roughly the standard outcome of seeking professional guidance on these matters. The regulatory landscape for nutrition advice in the 90s United States was a patchwork that varied significantly by state and created enormous space for people with minimal or no clinical training to offer dietary guidance in professional-looking settings. Registered dietitians, the credential that required a university degree in dietetics, a supervised clinical internship, and a licensing examination, existed and were genuinely trained. But the title nutritionist in many states required nothing at all. The difference between these credentials was not communicated to the public in any systematic way, which meant that a woman seeking professional guidance was navigating a landscape where the person she was consulting might have a rigorous clinical background or might have completed a weekend correspondence course. The advice often looked similar from the outside. The advice that emerged from this landscape, even from well-credentialed practitioners, was shaped by the same cultural assumptions that shaped everything else in the decade. The research base in clinical nutrition during the 90s was itself in transition. The field's understanding of the relationship between weight, health, and diet was more nuanced than popular culture suggested, but the popular culture version of nutritional science was considerably flatter. Fat bad, fewer overall better, exercise more. The clinical literature contained significant debate about these positions. The office across the desk, by and large, did not. What the era largely lacked, and what has become more central to clinical practice in the decades since, was any systematic attention to the psychological dimension of the person sitting across the desk. A plan that is clinically sound on paper interacts with a real human being who has a history, a relationship with food, a set of experiences, and a psychological context that affects how the plan will actually function in their life. Nutrition practice in the 90s was generally not equipped to assess that context, and the culture of the era provided little encouragement to try. The appointment was about the plan. The plan was about the numbers. The person was expected to implement the plan and report back. If it wasn't working, the intervention was almost always some version of the plan with more restriction, rather than any examination of whether the approach itself was the right one for this particular person at this particular time. That examination, when it happened at all, was happening in eating disorder treatment settings. Everywhere else, the plan was the answer, and the question was how to follow it better. Let's go to the bookstore. It is any given Saturday in the mid-90s, and the diet book section is enormous. Not a shelf, a section. It takes up the same square footage as the entire mystery novel aisle, and it is full, completely, abundantly, almost aggressively full, of books telling women how to eat. Dr. Atkins' New Diet Revolution, The Zone, Sugar Busters, Fit for Life, The Carbohydrate Addict's Diet, each one with a confident title, a doctor's name or a celebrity endorsement on the cover, and a theory so completely different from all the others that it was almost impossible not to notice that they could not all be right simultaneously. Low fat, high fat, no carbs, only carbs at certain times, eat for your blood type, eat like a caveman, eat nothing after 6. The contradictions were not a bug. They were the engine that kept the section fully stocked. The diet book was a genuinely remarkable publishing phenomenon. In most categories, a book that contradicted the best-selling book in the same genre would be seen as a competitive threat. In the diet book category, it was simply another entry, because each new book brought its own audience, the women who had tried the previous approach and found it wanting, who were now ready for a different explanation of why that one hadn't worked, and this one would. The publishing industry understood this dynamic perfectly. Diet books were reliable sellers with built-in repeat customers, not because readers bought the same book twice, but because they bought the next book, and the one after that, and the one after that. The category's vitality depended on the books not working permanently. The authors occupied a specific cultural role that blended medical authority, self-help motivation, and personal testimony in proportions that varied by book, but generally favoured the impression of scientific credibility over its reality. Some authors were physicians with genuine credentials and genuine research interests, whose ideas had merit but were being simplified into mass-market advice in ways that stripped nuance from findings that required nuance. Others were researchers whose specific findings were being applied far beyond what the research actually supported. Some were simply people who had lost weight and built a theory around their personal experience, presenting individual outcome as universal principle. The blood type diet, introduced by Peter D'Adamo in 1996, claimed that a person's blood type determined which foods their body processed optimally and which caused harm. The theory was not supported by clinical evidence. The specific nutritional mechanisms proposed did not correspond to how blood type actually functions in human physiology. None of this prevented the book from selling millions of copies, because it offered something extremely valuable in the 90s diet landscape, a personalised explanation. It told you that the reason previous diets had not worked was not your failure, but your biology, and that the solution was a specific plan tailored to exactly who you were. The appeal of that framing in a culture that had been blaming women for their own failures for a decade was considerable. What the diet book section represented in aggregate was a library of competing certainties, each one absolute within its own covers, each one implicitly or explicitly dismissing the approaches that came before it. The woman who had worked through several of them arrived at a specific kind of exhaustion, not just physical, not just from the restriction that the books had in common beneath their different theories, but intellectual. She'd been certain before, and it had not worked. She was certain again now, about a different thing. The certainty was the product. The book sold it season after season, and the section grew larger every year. Let's look at the pictures, because the before and after photograph was one of the most powerful and most manipulative tools in the 90s diet industry's toolkit, and it was everywhere. In the magazine advertisements, on the infomercials, in the Weight Watchers pamphlets, on the boxes of meal replacement products. The format was always the same. On the left, a woman photographed in unflattering lighting, in shapeless clothes, with a neutral or sad expression and a body that was presented as the problem. On the right, the same woman, thinner, smiling, in better lighting, in fitted clothes, presented as the solution. The before photo was not accidental. It was engineered. The lighting was chosen to emphasize shadow. The posture was chosen to emphasize width. The clothes were chosen to obscure shape. The after photo reversed every single one of those choices. You were not looking at a transformation. You were looking at two different photographs of the same person, taken under conditions specifically designed to produce two different impressions. The before and after format had a long history in advertising. Patent medicine advertisements from the 19th century had used similar structures, but the 90s diet industry refined it into something approaching an art form. The infomercial format was particularly hospitable to its logic. 30 minutes of television time allowed for multiple before and afters in sequence, each one building on the emotional architecture of the last, each person's testimony adding to a cumulative impression of inevitability. If all these different women, with all these different starting points, had achieved this result, then the result was achievable. The only variable was whether you would try. The testimonials that accompanied the photographs were carefully selected and carefully worded. They emphasized the emotional dimension, how the person had felt before, how they felt now, in ways that made the photographs feel like documentation of an interior change rather than exterior photography manipulation. She felt invisible. Now she feels confident. She was tired all the time. Now she has energy. The before state was described in language that evoked depression, limitation, and diminishment. The after state used the language of liberation and capability. The weight loss was presented not as a cosmetic outcome but as a life transformation, as though the primary benefit of the change was not aesthetic but existential. Researchers who studied before and after advertising in this period noted the specific ideological work the format performed. It naturalized the idea that a larger body was a before state, a preliminary condition preceding real life, and a smaller body was an after state, the destination where real life began. This framing positioned every woman who had not yet achieved the after as someone who was still waiting for her life to start. It was an extraordinarily effective mechanism for producing the motivation to purchase, because it attached the product not to a cosmetic preference, but to the possibility of becoming fully real, fully present, fully yourself. The format also, quietly and consistently, erased the complexity of what happened between the two photographs. The before and after implied a linear trajectory. You start here, you use the product, you arrive there. It did not show the weeks of difficult restriction, the social events navigated around the plan, the hunger that became ordinary, the relationship with food that was being quietly reorganized in ways that might not be visible in a photograph but were very much present in a life. The two photographs were presented as the whole story. Everything that actually happened between them was not in the frame. Let's talk about the women whose bodies were, technically speaking, their job. The supermodel era of the late 1980s and early 90s, Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Claudia Schiffer, Elle Macpherson, Linda Evangelista, had established a very specific set of physical parameters for what a woman in the public eye was supposed to look like. These women were tall, lean, and symmetrical in a way that represented roughly the top fraction of a percent of natural human variation. And then the culture looked at them and said, yes, that is normal. That is what women should look like. And every woman who was not a specific height and genetically structured like a specific kind of architecture, was implicitly, quietly, told that she had fallen short of a standard she had never had any realistic chance of meeting. The supermodel phenomenon of the early 90s was genuinely unprecedented in its cultural reach. Previous decades had their beauty standards and their iconic figures, but the 90s supermodel arrived at a specific convergence of fashion, MTV, advertising and celebrity culture that gave these women a visibility and cultural saturation that earlier models had not achieved. They were not just in fashion magazines. They were in music videos. They were in advertising campaigns for products that had nothing to do with fashion. They were in tabloids and on talk shows and at award ceremonies. They were, for a period, approximately everywhere, which meant the physical standard they represented was approximately everywhere too, held up continuously as the reference point against which ordinary women measured themselves and found the measurement coming up short. Linda Evangelista's famously quoted remark that she and her peers did not wake up for less than a certain sum per day was understood at the time primarily as an expression of professional confidence. It was also, inadvertently, an accurate description of the economics of the standard being set. The bodies being used as the cultural reference point for what women should look like belonged to people for whom maintaining those bodies was a full-time professional project. They had personal trainers. They had nutritionists, credentialed ones with genuine expertise. They had the financial resources to access whatever physical maintenance their careers required, and they had the professional motivation to prioritize that maintenance above essentially everything else, because their livelihood depended on it. The women looking at the resulting images in magazines and on television had none of those resources and all of that cultural instruction. The gap between the standard and the means available to meet it was enormous. The gap was not discussed. What the supermodel era also produced was a generation of girls who absorbed, at ages when identity is being formed, the idea that certain bodies were simply better, more valuable, more worthy of attention, more entitled to take up space. The supermodel's body was the body that stopped traffic, booked campaigns, appeared on covers, and was celebrated without qualification. Other bodies were, by implication, in various states of approximation toward that standard. Some were close, most were not close. The proximity was treated as a measure of something, even though what it actually measured was primarily genetics and the resources required to maintain a specific appearance professionally. None of that context was in the photograph. The photograph was just the photograph, and it said what it said, clearly and without ambiguity every single month. Let's talk about getting better, which in the 90s was complicated by the fact that a significant amount of the behaviour that qualified as disordered was also being celebrated by the culture at large. To work toward a recovery from disordered eating in the 1990s was to swim upstream against a very strong current. The clinicians who worked in eating disorder treatment during this decade describe a specific and exhausting dynamic. A patient would make progress in the clinical setting, rebuilding her relationship with food and her body, and then return home to a world that was actively reinforcing every thought pattern she'd just spent weeks carefully working to change. The magazines were still there, the television was still on, the comments at the dinner table were still happening, the diet starts, Monday conversation was everywhere. Recovery required not just clinical work, but a kind of sustained cultural resistance that the culture itself was not remotely interested in supporting. The eating disorder treatment landscape of the 90s was itself in a complicated moment. The field had made significant clinical advances in understanding both anorexia and bulimia. The diagnostic criteria were clearer, the medical risks were better documented, and effective treatment approaches were being developed and refined. Cognitive behavioral therapy had emerged as an evidence-based treatment for bulimia nervosa. Medical stabilization protocols for severe anorexia were better established than they had been in previous decades. The clinical picture was improving. The cultural picture was not cooperating. Treatment facilities existed, but access was deeply uneven. Inpatient and residential eating disorder treatment was expensive, often not covered by insurance, and geographically concentrated in certain areas. A woman who needed intensive treatment and did not live near a treatment centre and did not have insurance that covered it was, practically speaking, without access to the level of care her situation required. Outpatient therapy was more broadly available, but finding a therapist with specific eating disorder training rather than general mental health background was not straightforward in most communities. The infrastructure for treatment existed in pockets of the country and at price points that excluded large portions of the population who needed it. And even for those who accessed treatment, the re-entry into daily life presented the challenge described above, a world that had not changed while they were in treatment. Family members who meant well and commented on appearance, friends who were dieting and wanted company, a workplace with a break room full of diet culture conversation, a grocery store with an entire aisle of fat-free products. The culture did not pause its messaging because someone was working on their relationship with food. It continued at full volume, delivering its instructions through every channel available. What treatment providers in this era often found themselves doing was not just treating the disorder, but providing in the therapeutic space an alternative cultural environment, a place where different values about bodies and food and worth were explicitly held and consistently modelled as a counterweight to everything outside the door. The work was clinical, and it was also necessarily political. Getting better required building an internal framework strong enough to hold its shape against external pressure. That is an enormous amount to ask of someone who is already unwell. The people who did it were, in their own quiet way, doing something genuinely remarkable. And now let's think about what stayed. Because the 1990s diet craze did not end cleanly with the decade. It did not pack its bags at midnight on December 31st, 1999 and leave politely. What the 90s built, the infrastructure of self-surveillance, the reflexive calorie awareness, the persistent belief that a woman's body is something to be managed rather than inhabited, that infrastructure is still standing. The women who grew up inside the 90s diet culture are now in their 30s, 40s and 50s. Some of them have found their way to a different relationship with their bodies. Many of them are still working on it. Some of them passed pieces of it along before they had the chance to examine what they were passing. The 90s may be over, but the 90s diet craze left behind a very specific kind of archaeology, buried not in the ground but in the body, in the way a woman pauses before a meal, in the number she still knows by heart, in the reflex she is still, quietly, trying to unlearn. The cultural landscape that replaced the 90s diet craze did not represent a clean break. The 2000s brought some shifts, a modest mainstream push toward whole foods and away from the fat-free era's processed alternatives, a slowly growing body of research on the psychological costs of chronic dieting that began to reach popular culture. But the fundamental architecture remained largely intact. The diet industry adapted rather than retreated. It rebranded restriction as lifestyle. It reframed deprivation as clean eating and wellness and self-care, language that was softer and more positive but pointed in the same direction. The goal was still a smaller body, achieved through managed intake. The morality was still embedded in the food choices. The self-surveillance was still the practice, it just wore different clothing. Social media, which grew through the 2000s and fully arrived in the early 2010s, created new, and in some respects more efficient delivery systems for the same messages that 90s magazines had carried. Where a magazine could reach its readers monthly, an Instagram account could reach them continuously. Where a before and after photograph had to be printed and distributed, it could now be posted and shared globally in seconds. The mechanisms were faster and more personalized, and they reached younger people earlier. Researchers who had documented the impact of magazine exposure on body image in the 90s found that the same relationships held for social media exposure, often with stronger effect sizes. The medium had changed. The message had not changed much. The women who are now raising daughters grew up saturated in this. They absorbed the language and the logic and the habits at ages when they could not evaluate what they were absorbing. Some of them, through therapy or education, or the simple accumulation of hard-won perspective, have worked to disentangle themselves from what the decade put in them. Some of them find the work still ongoing, still catching themselves in old patterns of thought, still noticing the automatic evaluation, still remembering numbers they learned in 1994 that they would rather have forgotten. The 90s diet craze was not just a cultural moment. For the women who lived through it at formative ages, it was a formation. And formations are not undone by the calendar turning over. What the decade left behind, alongside all the harm it caused, was also the beginning of a conversation. The eating disorder advocates who had been working in relative obscurity through the 90s began, in the decades that followed, to find larger audiences. The research on weight stigma, on the ineffectiveness of chronic dieting, on the psychological costs of body surveillance, gradually moved from academic journals toward public conversation. The body positivity movement, which grew through the 2000s and 2010s, drew directly on the critique of diet culture that clinicians and advocates had been building since the 90s. The 90s were, in their own grim way, the before photograph. What came after, incomplete, imperfect, still very much in progress, was at least a different kind of conversation. One that had learned something. One that was trying, however fitfully, to say, enough. You were enough. You always were. Let's talk about the words. Because one of the most quietly effective tools of the 90s diet culture was not a product or a program or a photograph. It was language. The specific vocabulary that the era built around food and bodies and the project of changing them. Words that arrived so consistently from so many directions that they stopped sounding like choices and started sounding like facts. Words like cheat and indulge and guilty pleasure. Words like discipline and commitment and falling off the wagon. Words that organised eating into a moral framework, not a nutritional one, not a biological one, but a moral one, in which some choices were virtuous and some were failures, and the woman making them was always the one being graded. The word cheat is worth a moment of attention on its own. In the 90s diet context, cheating meant eating something outside the plan. It meant the pasta, or the slice of birthday cake, or the order of fries that you had decided in a moment of hunger or pleasure or simple normalcy to eat. The word cheat does not describe a nutritional event. It describes a moral violation. To cheat is to betray something, a promise, an agreement, a system of rules you had committed to honour. Applying that word to eating a piece of bread reframed a physiological act as a character flaw, and the word was everywhere. Diet programs used it. Magazines used it. Women used it to describe their own eating to each other, having absorbed the framing so completely that it no longer registered as a metaphor. It was just how you talked about food, naturally without thinking, which was exactly how the most effective language works. The phrase guilty pleasure performed a similar operation. It appeared in food contexts throughout the decade, guilty pleasure recipes in magazines, guilty pleasure admissions on talk shows, the self-deprecating confession of having eaten something outside the approved category. The word guilty attached moral weight to pleasure. It suggested that enjoyment of certain foods was not simply enjoyment, but a small transgression requiring acknowledgement. You ate the thing. You enjoyed it. You reported the guilt alongside the enjoyment, as though naming the guilt was a form of penance that made the pleasure permissible. It was an extraordinarily efficient mechanism. It allowed the food to be consumed while the ideology was simultaneously maintained. Nothing was resolved. The cycle simply continued, with the language providing just enough of a release valve to keep it running. The vocabulary of willpower deserves equal attention. Willpower, as the 90s diet culture deployed it, was the faculty responsible for managing food intake, the internal force that stood between you and the things you were not supposed to eat. You had it, or you didn't. You exercised it successfully, or you failed to deploy it. The concept placed the entire responsibility for eating behavior inside the individual's volitional control in a decision-making capacity that was supposed to override hunger, mood, social context, habit, and physiological drive, indefinitely and without assistance. The research on self-regulation, which developed considerably through the 90s and the following decade, described something far more complex and far more limited than this framing suggested. The capacity for self-control is affected by sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and the specific metabolic state produced by restriction itself. It is not a fixed, unlimited resource. It interacts with the body's own regulatory systems in ways that make sustained override of hunger signals genuinely difficult at a biological level. None of this appeared in the diet books. The diet book said, "This requires willpower. If it isn't working, you need more of it. Try harder. Begin again on Monday." What this language built, across years of consistent use, was an internal monologue in which eating was never simply eating. Every food choice carried a moral charge. Every meal was a small test of character. Every moment of hunger was an opportunity either to demonstrate control or to reveal its absence. The women who grew up inside the 90s absorbed this vocabulary at ages when the language of self-evaluation is being formed, and it became part of the furniture of the mind, not chosen, not examined, simply present. Recognizing it as installed, rather than inherent, turned out to be one of the more difficult steps in the long work of moving past it. Because by the time most women tried, the voice had been there so long it had started to sound exactly like their own. Let's go to the office. It is 1995. You're wearing a blazer with shoulder pads because the decade has not quite released that particular architectural choice, and you're sitting in a meeting room that is, statistically speaking, populated primarily by men. You are competent, you are prepared, you work to be here. And somewhere underneath all of that, running as a low-grade background process you have learned to manage alongside your actual work, is an awareness of how you look, how your body appears in the chair, whether the jacket fits correctly, whether any of this is affecting how you are perceived. This was not paranoia. Research conducted throughout the 90s documented what economists would later formalize as the appearance premium, the measurable professional advantage associated with meeting conventional standards of physical attractiveness in workplace environments. For women, the premium was real, and its inverse was equally real. The professional consequences of falling outside the accepted physical range were documented, consistent, and almost never spoken about in the environments where they were operating. The 90s professional woman existed inside a specific and largely unacknowledged double bind regarding her appearance. She was operating in workplaces that had only recently and incompletely accepted her presence, where the standards of professional credibility had been built around a male default, and where her competence was statistically more likely to be questioned than her male colleagues. At the same time, too much visible attention to appearance risked being dismissed as superficial or insufficiently serious. Too little attention risked a negative evaluation on the dimension that research confirmed was affecting her opportunities anyway. The lane she was expected to navigate was narrow, implicit, and officially non-existent. She was supposed to meet the standard without appearing to try, and to bear the professional consequences of not meeting it, and to never mention that any of this was happening. The diet culture of the decade fed directly into this professional landscape. A body that read as disciplined was, in the cultural logic of the 90s, a body that communicated self-control, organisation, and the capacity to manage competing demands effectively, qualities that professional environments valued and rewarded in their most legible employees. This conflation was never made explicitly in any policy document or performance review. It operated through implication, through the texture of professional interactions, through observable patterns in hiring and promotion that researchers documented but that rarely surfaced in official conversation. The body was a professional variable. Its management was a professional responsibility. And the 90s diet culture had made very clear what proper management was supposed to look like. Women in client-facing industries described throughout the decade and in retrospective accounts the specific and exhausting calculations they made about their bodies in professional contexts. Appearance was a variable they monitored alongside performance, sometimes above it, in environments where the stakes of falling outside the physical standard felt immediate and concrete. These were not fringe experiences confined to particular industries. They appeared consistently across sectors, across professional levels, across regions of the country. The workplace did not exist outside the culture. It was an expression of the same values, the same hierarchies, the same unspoken expectations, operating in a context where the economic consequences of failing to meet them were more direct than in other areas of life. The 90s diet craze was the machinery that produced and maintained the standard. The workplace was one of the places where the standard was enforced. Women moved between the two every day, carrying both with them, managing both simultaneously, and rarely having the language to describe what the combination actually cost. Let's talk about who the diet culture was ultimately performing for. Because one of the most important things to understand about the 90s diet craze is that it was not primarily about health, despite the health language that surrounded it. Research on the stated motivations for dieting in this era found, consistently, that appearance was the dominant driver, specifically the desire to be more attractive, more acceptable, more visible in the ways the culture rewarded. And the culture that rewarded particular bodies was one in which the evaluating gaze was, predominantly and explicitly, directed by a male-oriented standard. The standards being pursued were the standards of mainstream conventional attractiveness. The before and after photographs implied a viewer for the after. The magazines that ran diet advice also ran articles about what men found appealing. These were not adjacent conversations. They were the same conversation, running in parallel columns on the same page. The theorist Laura Mulvey had introduced the concept of the male gaze in the 1970s, the idea that mainstream visual culture was structured around a masculine perspective, presenting women as objects of visual evaluation rather than as subjects with their own interiority. By the 90s, this framework had become useful not just as film theory, but as a description of something operating across the entire cultural landscape simultaneously. The diet industry did not create this dynamic, but it was built inside it, and it profited from the specific form of self-surveillance the dynamic produced, the way women had been trained, gradually and thoroughly, to see themselves from the outside, to experience their own bodies as things to be looked at and assessed, rather than as selves to be lived in. What made the 90s particularly interesting in this regard was the degree to which external evaluation had become internalized self-surveillance. Women in the decade's diet culture were not primarily restricting because men were explicitly directing them too, though the social environment provided its own forms of direction. They were restricting because they had absorbed the evaluative framework so completely that it was now running from the inside. The critical voice was their own voice. The standard being applied was one they had adopted and now deployed against themselves with an efficiency no external critic could match, because an external critic could be argued with, ignored, or left behind. An internal one travelled everywhere. It was present at the scale in the morning and at the restaurant in the evening, and in the dressing room under the fluorescent lights and in the quiet of the bedroom at night. It had no off switch because no one had ever installed one. The psychologist Sandra Bartke, writing in the late 80s and read widely through the 90s, described this dynamic as a disciplinary practice, the way women had been trained, through cultural repetition, to monitor their own bodies as though an external evaluator were always present and always forming a judgment. She drew on Foucault's description of the panopticon, the prison architecture designed so that inmates could never know when they were being observed and therefore had to behave as though they were perpetually visible. The women of the 90s diet culture had, in a very real sense, built their own version of this structure inside themselves. They were simultaneously the watched and the watcher. The diet, the daily weigh-in, the food diary, the careful navigation of a restaurant menu, these were not only behaviours, they were performances staged for an internal audience that was never absent and was never fully satisfied with what it saw. Recognising the mechanism was necessary, but recognition alone was not sufficient to dismantle something that had been constructed over the course of an entire formative decade, one magazine and one morning weigh-in, and one guilty pleasure at a time. Let's move toward the end of the decade, because the 90s diet craze did not go entirely unchallenged. The challenges were quieter than the diet industry, and less well funded than the magazine companies, but they existed, and they were building towards something. Throughout the decade, in academic journals and clinical conferences and small circulation publications that most women in the checkout aisle would never see, researchers and clinicians and advocates were documenting what was happening and arguing for a different way of understanding bodies, health, and the cultural machinery that had been running at full power for the better part of 10 years. The reckoning was slow, and it was incomplete, and it did not arrive in time for the women who needed it most urgently. But it was beginning, the way most important things begin, not with an announcement, but with a small and persistent accumulation of evidence that something had gone seriously wrong. The body of research that challenged the decade's core assumptions grew steadily through the 90s. Studies following women for several years after completion of various weight loss programs found that the majority of weight lost was regained, and in a significant portion of cases, more was regained than had originally been lost. Researchers studying the psychological effects of chronic dieting found consistent associations with increased preoccupation with food, elevated rates of binge-eating behaviour, and measurably reduced overall well-being. The set point theory, which proposed that the body actively defends a particular weight range through metabolic and hormonal adjustments, resisting changes in either direction, was gaining clinical support and providing a biological explanation for the patterns that women had been experiencing for years and blaming entirely on themselves. The plan was not failing because the women lacked dedication. The body was doing exactly what bodies are biologically designed to do when their energy supply is restricted. The system was working against the plan, and the plan had never acknowledged that the system existed. The fat acceptance movement, which had roots in the late 1960s and had been building its intellectual framework for 2 decades, found a somewhat larger platform through the 90s as its critique of diet culture became harder to dismiss. The movement argued that bodies of all sizes deserved basic dignity and respect, that the medical and cultural stigmatization of larger bodies was causing measurable harm, and that the evidence base for many of the era's most confident claims about weight and health was considerably shakier than the confidence suggested. These arguments were not mainstream in the 90s. In many quarters they were actively ridiculed, dismissed as rationalization, as giving up, as being dangerous to public health. But the work was being done, the writing was accumulating, and the intellectual foundation was being laid for the conversations that would follow in the decades ahead. Naomi Wolf's book, The Beauty Myth, published in 1991, reached a broad popular audience with an argument that the standards being imposed on women's appearance were not natural or inevitable, but constructed. Mechanisms for redirecting women's energy and ambition toward an endless self-improvement project, rather than toward the exercise of power in public life. The book was widely read and widely discussed, and it gave a generation of women the beginning of a vocabulary for something they had been experiencing without being able to fully name. It did not immediately change behaviour, these things rarely do. But it changed the terms of the conversation, made room for doubt where there had previously been only instruction, and planted a question that would take years to fully germinate. Who decided this standard? In whose interest does it operate? And am I going to keep accepting it as though it arrived from nowhere? By the late 90s, something was shifting at the edges. Not yet in the centre, the magazine covers were still the magazine covers, the diet book section was still enormous, the before and after photographs were still running on every other page of every women's publication in the country. But at the edges, where the next conversation was quietly forming, women who had grown up inside the decade's machinery were beginning the long work of understanding what had been done to them. Not all of them, not quickly, not without significant difficulty. But the questioning had started, and questions, once genuinely asked, are difficult to unask. The clinicians working in eating disorder treatment through the 90s describe a gradual but perceptible shift in how their patients talked about their experiences toward the end of the decade, a greater awareness among some women that the behaviours they were struggling with had not emerged from nowhere, but from a specific cultural environment that had taught them, explicitly and implicitly, to relate to their bodies as problems requiring constant management. That awareness did not resolve the struggle, but it changed its texture, and it changed the conversation possible in the treatment room. The culture, even as it continued running at full volume, had begun to generate its own critique. Quietly, at the margins, in the voices of researchers and advocates and women comparing notes with each other in ways that the diet industry had not anticipated and could not easily monetize. Something else was beginning. It would take time. It would remain incomplete. But it was there, and it was real, and it was the first light of a very long dawn. Let's end the body of this story the way all good stories end, not with the machine still running unopposed, but with the people who decided quietly or loudly or somewhere in between that they were done letting it run. Because for everything the 90s diet craze built and maintained and sold and enforced, there were women inside that same decade who looked at it clearly and said no. Not in the headline-grabbing way that the diet industry announced its latest product. In the slower, more durable way that actual change tends to move, through research and writing and clinical practice, and the simple radical act of one woman telling another woman the truth about what was happening to both of them. The researchers came first, or rather, they had been there all along, publishing findings that contradicted the era's confident claims in journals that the magazine industry did not subscribe to. Psychologists like Janet Polivy and Peter Herman had been studying the effects of dietary restraint since the 1970s, and their work through the 90s built a detailed and damaging picture of what chronic restriction actually produced in the human mind and body. Their research on what they called the restraint theory documented how the attempt to override hunger through cognitive control produced paradoxically a heightened preoccupation with food and an increased vulnerability to eating past intended limits when the restraint broke down. The cycle was not a character flaw. It was a predictable psychological response to a specific set of conditions. The conditions were what the diet culture had been producing and selling for years. The research said so clearly in published papers with data. The magazines did not run the papers. The clinicians pushed back from inside treatment rooms. Therapists and dietitians who worked with women experiencing disordered eating developed, through the 90s, a set of approaches that directly contradicted the era's dominant framework. The work of Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, who published their book on intuitive eating in 1995, offered a framework built entirely on the principle that the human body was equipped to regulate its own hunger and fullness signals when those signals were respected rather than overridden. The approach was not about eating whatever you wanted with no awareness. It was about dismantling the system of dietary rules and moral food hierarchies that the culture had installed, and rebuilding a relationship with eating based on internal rather than external cues. It was, in the context of 1995, a genuinely countercultural proposition. It was also, for the women who found it, sometimes life-changing. The fat acceptance advocates continued their work with the particular persistence of people who've been dismissed for a long time and have decided to continue anyway. Writers and activists within that movement were producing, throughout the 90s, analysis of the diet industry's economics, the medical establishment's weight bias, and the ways that the cultural stigmatization of larger bodies was functioning as a form of discrimination with measurable consequences for employment, healthcare access, and daily quality of life. This work was not on the bestseller list. It circulated in smaller communities, in zines and newsletters and early internet forums, among women who had found each other and were comparing notes and building something that the mainstream had not yet decided to pay attention to. The mainstream would eventually. These were the people doing the work before it was recognised as work worth doing, and then there were the ordinary women, the ones who did not write papers or publish books, but who, at some point in the decade, put down the magazine or stepped off the scale or sat across from a friend and said out loud that they were exhausted, that the plan was not working and had never worked, and they were tired of believing that the failure was theirs. These conversations happened in kitchens and on phone calls, and in the parking lots of gyms. They were not recorded, they did not make the news. But they were the beginning of something that the research and the books and the advocacy were also building toward, a collective, gradual, imperfect shift in what women were willing to accept as true about themselves and their bodies. The 90s diet craze was a formidable machine. It was well-funded and culturally entrenched and very good at absorbing and neutralizing its own critics. But it was not immune to the slow accumulation of women who had simply had enough of it. The pushback was not a revolution. It was quieter than that. It was a generation of women, one at a time, deciding that the voice telling them they were not enough was not, in the end, a voice worth listening to. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the only way anything like this ever actually changes. And so here we are, at the end of a very long day in a decade that asked a great deal of women and gave very little back in return. You have travelled through the 90s tonight, through the bathroom scale and the magazine rack, through the fat-free cookie aisle, and the aerobic studio, and the talk show set, and the diet book section, and the meeting room where someone's body was always the subject. You have seen the machinery of it, the economics, the language, the photographs engineered to produce a specific feeling in the person looking at them, the voice that the decade installed in so many women and then told them was their own. It was a lot. It was genuinely a lot. And the women who lived through it, who grew up inside it, who were formed by it at ages when formation is permanent and irreversible, they carried it with remarkable endurance. Not because it was easy, not because it did not cost them something, but because people are at their core extraordinarily stubborn about surviving the things that are supposed to diminish them. The women of the 90s went to the meetings and counted the points and pressed play on the tape and stood on the scale in the cold bathroom at 7 in the morning, and they also raised children and built careers and loved people and made things and held the world together in the 10,000 quiet ways that the world depends on and rarely acknowledges. They did all of it simultaneously. They did all of it while running a background process of self-surveillance that the culture had installed and never offered to uninstall. That is not weakness. That is an almost incomprehensible amount of endurance, directed in a direction that did not deserve it. The reckoning with what the 90s built is still ongoing. The women who were 14 in 1993 are in their 40s now, and many of them are still doing the quiet, unglamorous work of examining what the decade put in them and deciding piece by piece what they want to keep and what they are ready to set down. That work does not make the news. It does not have a before and after photograph. It happens in therapy offices and in conversations between friends and in private moments of noticing a thought and choosing, this time, not to follow it. It is slow and it is real and it counts for something. So tonight, as you settle into whatever warm and comfortable space you have arranged for yourself, with your clean sheets and your quiet room and the luxury of a body that is not being evaluated by anyone at this particular moment, maybe hold a quiet thought for the women of that decade, for the ones who struggled visibly, and the ones who struggled invisibly, and the ones who are still struggling now, for the ones who found their way to something gentler, and for the ones who are still walking toward it. They deserved better than the decade gave them. Most people do. And you, listening to this, in whatever shape and size and particular configuration you have arrived at tonight, you are not a before. You are not a project. You are not a number on a scale or a column in a food diary or a measurement taken under unflattering light. You are a person in a body at rest, and that is enough. It always was. Sleep well.